Some families carry secrets they never meant to keep. We like to believe that the people we love most told us everything that mattered. But sometimes the hardest truths about money, about land, about what a man was willing to do to keep his family from knowing he was scared, don't come to the surface until after the funeral, until you're alone in a farmhouse that feels too quiet, sorting through a desk, and you find something that changes the shape of everything you thought you understood about your marriage. Have you ever learned something about someone you loved after they were gone? Something that made you grieve them all over again? Not just for losing them, but for what they carried alone? In Pawnee County, Oklahoma, in the late autumn of 2003, a woman named Loretta Hale was sitting at her kitchen table 3 weeks after her husband's funeral, looking at a stack of papers she didn't fully understand and trying to figure out what was left. Dale Hale had farmed 480 acres of winter wheat and run a small Angus cattle operation in northeast Oklahoma since he was 23 years old. He built that place field by field across 38 years of hard work, through dry summers and collapsing wheat prices and every kind of financial pressure that farms out here absorb in silence. He was 61 when a heart attack dropped him near the grain bin on the 14th of October, at the beginning of harvest. Worst week of the year to be suddenly gone. 3 weeks later, Loretta was still in the house, still making coffee at 5 in the morning, still feeding the herd, still trying to understand what exactly she and Dale owed, and to whom, and whether staying on this land she had loved for 33 years was actually possible, or whether it would be taken from her by a bank that had known something she hadn't. There was an envelope in the roll-top desk in the corner of the farm office. A plain manila envelope with a rubber band around it, tucked into a false bottom drawer Dale had used since his father's time. On the outside, in Dale's careful handwriting, were 4 words: Pawnee first, do not lose. That envelope held a document the bank had never clearly explained to Loretta. A document she had never signed. A document that, according to the loan officer who called 3 days after the funeral, would now need to be settled, along with everything else, within 90 days. The bank knew the envelope existed. That's what makes this story different. Pawnee County sits in the role of northeast Oklahoma's red dirt country, where the land flattens and folds in long, easy waves, and the sky takes up more of the picture than most people from cities are used to. In November, after harvest, the wheat fields go to stubble, and the color drains down to a kind of pale gold that looks like it's been there since before anyone was alive to see it. The cattle stand in groups near the fence line. The wind moves through without asking permission. Dale Hale's family had farmed that ground since his grandfather broke it in 1929, which was, by any accounting, the worst possible year to start something new in agriculture. But they stayed. Depression, Dust Bowl, low commodity prices, high debt, they stayed. By the time Dale was a teenager working with his father, the land had a permanence to it that felt older than anything else he could name. He once told Loretta, early in their marriage, that farming wasn't exactly a choice for a man like him. It was just the shape his life had taken, and he couldn't imagine it differently. Loretta had grown up in Stillwater, 40 miles southwest. Her father was a mechanic. She'd never set foot on a working wheat farm until she met Dale at a church social in the spring of 1970. They married the following year. She learned everything about the farm from the inside, not from books, but from seasons. First winter, she burned dinner trying to feed the field hands during baling. Second year, she learned what a note renewal was and why the weeks leading up to it made Dale quiet at the table. Third year, she understood that farming and fear existed inside the same household, and that a good marriage out here meant learning not to let one swallow the other. They had 2 children. Travis was born in 1972. He grew up on a farm and hated most of it by his mid-teens, left for Tulsa at 22, and built a solid career in commercial HVAC that had nothing to do with soil or rain gauges. Not a bad life, just a different one. He visited at Christmas. He called on birthdays. He and Dale had found a way to be civil about the fact that the farm had skipped a generation. Cassie was born in 1975. She stayed, not out of obligation exactly. She'd had scholarship offers, had briefly considered nursing school, but she genuinely loved the work. By her mid-20s, she was running the cattle operation almost entirely on her own. Dale had given her a larger role in the farm's daily logistics than most fathers of his generation would have allowed. She drove the combine. She negotiated with the co-op. She understood the numbers better than Travis ever had, and she understood what those numbers actually meant inside a farm year better than most bank officers. The farm itself was 480 acres of owned ground, not rented, though land values in Pawnee County by 2003 range between $600 and $850 per acre, depending on the section and its drainage. Their main enterprise was winter wheat, 500 to 600 bushels in a good season, significantly less in a dry one. They also ran 40 head of Angus on the south pasture. It was not a large operation. It was a paid-into operation, meaning most of its equity had been built over decades of small payments and small sacrifices in years when Dale and Loretta took almost nothing out for themselves. The operating loan at Pawnee First National Bank, the only bank they had used since 1971, ran between $90,000 and $150,000 most years, depending on input costs and how deep into the growing season they were. By October 2003, it stood at $142,000. That number was not unusual. That number was manageable. What Loretta did not know, what the bank had never explained clearly, was that in the spring of 2001, Dale had signed a second document, a second lien, against the South Field. 160 acres. $87,000. He had done it alone, without telling her, without asking her to co-sign, though as a joint owner of the property, her signature arguably should have been required. She found that out later. First, she had to find the envelope. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the funeral. Loretta had been up since 4:30. She couldn't sleep past that anymore, and mornings felt safer than the long middle of the night. She was at the kitchen table with coffee she didn't want and a legal pad with 3 columns of numbers she'd been trying to organize since the week before. One column was incoming, government program payments, the year's wheat proceeds that had already cleared the September cattle sale. One column was outgoing, machinery payments, insurance, input costs, the co-op balance. The third column was things she didn't know how to categorize yet. The number at the bottom of the third column was $142,000. That was the operating line. She knew about that one. The call was from a man named Gary Prentice, who introduced himself as the new agricultural lending officer at Pawnee First National. The previous officer, a man named Howard, who had worked with Dale for 22 years, had retired in August. Gary Prentice had been transferred down from the Tulsa branch. He'd been in Pawnee County less than 3 months. He spoke in a careful, professional tone. He offered his condolences. Then he said there were some loan matters he needed to discuss with her at her earliest convenience, and that given the timing, crop cycle, note structure, it would be best to meet soon. He mentioned the operating note. He mentioned the need for a plan going forward. He offered to come to the farm or meet at the bank, whichever she preferred. He did not, on that first call, mention the second lien. That choice, the decision not to mention it on the first call, would matter later. Cassie was in the barn when the call ended. Loretta walked out to find her and didn't know how to start the sentence. She said, "The bank called." Cassie said, I figured they would. They stood in the cold November air for a moment, looking at the herd spread out across the south pasture. Then Travis drove in from Tulsa that weekend. He came in on Friday night, and by Saturday afternoon, he had gone through most of the file drawer by the kitchen door, the one with the insurance papers, the equipment titles, and the land deed, and had started talking about his timeline. He was not unkind. He was practical, maybe too quickly. He said the operating note was a heavy lift on this size of operation. He said input costs weren't getting better and weren't going to. He said the land was worth real money now, and there were buyers for good Oklahoma wheat ground. He said that if they sold the whole 480 at even $700 per acre, Loretta would clear close to $290,000 after the operating note paid off, and she could move to something smaller and not be alone out here. Cassie said, "She's not alone out here." Travis said, "You know what I mean?" They didn't yell. The Hale family didn't yell. But the silence that followed sat at the table for the rest of dinner like an uninvited third person. And Loretta ate half of what was on her plate and then said she was tired and went to bed and lay there in the dark listening to them talk in the kitchen in lowered voices. That night she prayed. Not a formal prayer. Not a verse and response prayer. Just her own voice inside her head, in the dark, asking for clarity. She didn't ask to keep the farm. She wasn't sure yet if that was even the right thing to ask for. She asked to understand what she was actually facing. She asked for the presence of mind to see clearly. In the morning, she went to the farm office. The rolltop desk had been Dale's father's, solid oak. It smelled like old wood and old paper and faintly like the 3-in-1 oil Dale used on the drawer tracks every spring. She opened the center section first. Paid bills. Machinery manuals. A row of pocket notebooks going back to 1986. She stood there a long time, turning the notebooks over in her hands without opening them, feeling the weight of 38 years of seasons in the handwriting on the covers. As she tried the bottom right drawer, it stuck slightly, as it always had. She pulled harder and felt a small give along the back of the drawer, a tiny shift in the wood, like a separation that wasn't supposed to be there. She reached to the back. Her hand found paper. The manila envelope had a rubber band around it that had gone brittle with age and snapped when she tried to slide it off. Pawnee first, do not lose. For words in Dale's handwriting. The ink had faded slightly at the edges the way paper does when it sits somewhere dry and dark for a long time. She sat down in the desk chair and opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a copy of a promissory note dated March 14, 2001. The second was a deed of trust, a lien instrument, against the south field of the Hale farm, legal description block 4, Section 18, Township 17 North, Range 5 East, Pawnee County, Oklahoma. 160 acres. Principal amount, $87,000. Interest rate, 6.75%. Term, 10 years. Loretta read it 3 times. Then she read the signature line. Dale's signature was there, clear and firm. The box next to it, labeled co-owner/joint signature, if applicable, was blank. Her name was nowhere on the document. She sat very still for a long time. In 2001, she tried to remember what that spring had looked like. A hailstorm in late April. She remembered that. Bad one. Took most of the southwest quarter. She remembered Dale driving out after the storm and coming back quieter than usual. She remembered him being at the kitchen table for several nights in a row with the adding machine. She remembered asking him once if things were all right and him saying yes, just running numbers. She had believed him. She had given him the privacy of it, as she had learned over 30 years of farm marriage to do. What she hadn't known was that Dale had gone to the bank that March, a full month before the hailstorm. She realized now, looking at the date, and borrowed $87,000 against the South Field to cover the previous year's operating note payment. The year before the hail had also been short. He had been carrying a gap he hadn't told her about. He had gone alone to the bank, pledged 160 acres of their best ground, and hadn't come home and said a word about it. The question that followed Loretta out of the farm office and into the kitchen and through the rest of that gray November day was not one she could answer. Why didn't he tell me? She had her guesses. Dale was a man who handled things. That was how he thought of himself, how his father had raised him to think of himself. Farmers of his generation in that county did not easily admit the full shape of what they owed. There was a private mathematics to it, a personal ledger that ran separate from the joint one. She understood this. She had seen it in his father. She had seen it in other men at the co-op. The debt wasn't shame exactly. Farming debt never fully was, not when it came from weather. But carrying it alone was a way of protecting the people around you from the full weight of what the land sometimes required. She thought about the last 2 years of Dale's life. He had been quieter than usual. She had chalked it up to age, to the accumulating tiredness of a long physical life. Now she wondered how much of that quiet had been this specific envelope. He had been managing a second debt for more than 2 years. Managing it alone, making small payments from a separate account she hadn't known existed, trying to close the gap before anyone else needed to know it was there. And the bank, Pawnee First, with its new loan officer who had never met Dale Hale in his life, had a lien on 160 of their 480 acres, and that lien was legally questionable in a way Loretta did not yet have the vocabulary to fully articulate. But somehow, reading that blank co-owner's signature line for the 4th time, she felt in her body before she could name it in words. She put the envelope on the kitchen table. Then she called Cassie in from the barn. Cassie read the documents. Her expression did the same thing Loretta's had, still, then slowly something harder and more focused. "He never told you," Cassie said. "No," Loretta said. "He never told me. Did he tell Travis?" "I don't think so." Cassie folded the papers back into the envelope. "Does the bank know you found this?" Loretta thought about that. "They called me 3 days ago, before I found it." Cassie looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then they already knew it was here. That Sunday, Loretta went to church. She had not missed a Sunday at Pawnee County Baptist in 31 years, not counting the Sunday after Dale's bypass surgery in 1998, when she had stayed home and read the 23rd Psalm at the kitchen table instead, which she figured counted for something. This Sunday, she sat in the 3rd pew, which had been their pew since 1978, and she did not feel particularly peaceful, and she did not feel like singing. And during the sermon, she looked at her hands at her lap and thought about the South Field. After the service, their deacon, a retired man named Leonard Pryor who had farmed cotton south of Marietta for 30 years before moving up to Pawnee County to be near his son, found her in the side yard. "I heard Dale left some financial matters behind," he said. "Not gossip." He said it the way a man who has lived through his own foreclosure notices says things, quietly and directly, without pretending there's a polite version of the conversation. Loretta told him about the note. Not all of it. Enough. Leonard listened. Then he said, "There's a farm advocacy group out of Stillwater. Farm Bureau Legal Aid. I've seen them undo bad paperwork before. A note signed by one owner when 2 names are on the deed, that's not clean. That's not nothing what you're sitting on." He gave her a name, a woman attorney named Patricia Drummond. "You don't need to do this alone," Leonard said. "You've got people standing with you, if you'll let them." Loretta thanked him. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table and thought about whether asking for help was weakness or just sanity, and decided that 33 years of farming had probably used up her quota of suffering in silence, and that if Dale had been able to make an $87,000 decision in private, she could at least make a phone call in daylight. She wrote down Patricia Drummond's name on the corner of the legal pad. She put it next to the envelope. She did not ask God to save the farm in her prayers that night. She had learned by 60 that the prayers most often answered were the ones that asked for the right thing: strength, clarity, patience, the courage to keep your head when the arithmetic looks impossible, rather than the specific outcome you had already decided you wanted. She asked to be honest. She asked not to let fear make her small. She asked, in the quiet of the bedroom she had shared with Dale for 33 years, for the grace to carry what he had left behind. Then she turned off the light. She called Patricia Drummond at 8 o'clock Monday morning. Gary Prentice's office at Pawnee First National was the second door on the left past the ATM lobby and a framed photograph of the bank's founding in 1923. He was younger than the office, maybe 35, press shirt, the kind of shoes that said Tulsa. He stood when Loretta came in. He was not rude. He was careful in the way that people are careful when they know more than the person sitting across from them. Cassie had insisted on coming. She sat to Loretta's right and said little. Gary Prentice opened a file. He laid out 2 documents side by side on the desk. The operating note, $142,000, due for annual review, and the second instrument, the 2001 note against the South Field, $87,000 original principal. $74,600 remaining after 2 years of payments. Dale had apparently been drawing from a secondary account Loretta hadn't known existed. "We understand this is a difficult time," Gary Prentice said. "Our preference is always to work with families in situations like this. But I want to be transparent. The operating note renewal window is 60 days from today, and the second instrument has a due-on-death acceleration clause, which means the full remaining balance is technically callable now. That. How much total are we looking at?" Cassie said, "Combined, $216,000. The number sat on the desk between them. Loretta had already run the math. Their best-case scenario, a full wheat crop, co-op prices flat, cattle prices holding where they'd been in the fall, would clear somewhere around $80,000 in a strong year. Against $216,000 in callable debt with a 90-day window, the arithmetic was straightforward and it was bad. "What are you recommending?" Loretta said. Gary Prentice said the bank would want to see a repayment proposal. He said they could consider refinancing the operating note on new terms. He also said he was, of course, obligated to mention that a voluntary sale of portions of the property would satisfy both instruments and leave Loretta in a, he paused here, comfortable position. "Comfortable," Cassie said. "That's the word I'd use, yes." Loretta said she needed some time to review her options with counsel. Gary Prentice said, of course, that made perfect sense. He handed her a packet, 2 pages, bullet points, with options for resolution printed at the top. In the parking lot, Cassie sat in the truck with the engine off and read the options sheet. He never mentioned the co-owner's signature requirement. She said, "No," Loretta said. He didn't. Patricia Drummond needs to see both documents. What Patricia Drummond would explain 3 days later was this. Under Oklahoma property law, a deed of trust against jointly held real property, property titled in both spouses' names, as the Hale farm had been since 1978, typically requires the signatures of both owners to be fully and unambiguously enforceable. Dale had signed a loan. The bank had accepted his signature alone. Whether the previous loan officer, Howard, who had known the Hales for 22 years, had known Loretta's name was on the deed, and processed the lien informally out of long familiarity, or whether it had been a straightforward oversight, was a question that would require document examination. What meant practically, the bank's legal position on the second lien was not airtight. They could litigate to establish it. Litigation would take time and money and would likely end in settlement rather than judgment, given the signature question. But they could negotiate. Patricia Drummond sent a letter to Pawnee First National's legal department 3 weeks after Loretta's meeting with Gary Prentice. It cited the signature question. It requested full disclosure of the note origination process. It did not use the word litigation. It didn't have to. Gary Prentice stopped mentioning the due-on-death acceleration clause almost immediately after the letter arrived. The stretch from late November into December was one of the harder passages in Loretta's life, and she had known some hard passages. Travis came back for a weekend in late November, and Loretta sat him down and told him about the second note. All of it. She watched his face move through several expressions: surprise, then something close to anger, then something quieter and harder to name. "He never told me either," Travis said. "I know. I knew things were tight in '01. You could feel it. But he said the hailstorm hit the crop and the insurance covered most of the loss. That's close to what he told me." They sat in the kitchen. Outside, the November fields were bare and gray under a flat sky. Travis put both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table. "You understand that fighting this could cost more than it saves," he said finally. "If the bank decides to litigate the whole thing regardless, lawyers are expensive, and this takes time you may not have. I understand the risk." "Mom, I'm just trying." "Travis." She said his name quietly, not sharply. "I'm not asking you to decide for me. I'm telling you what I found and what I'm doing. I'm not selling this whole place without understanding what it actually costs first." Travis was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the bare wheat stubble. "What does Cassie think?" he said. "Cassie thinks we fight." "That doesn't surprise me." More silence. Then Travis said, "What do you actually want, Mom?" "Not what you feel like you're supposed to want. What do you actually want?" Loretta thought about that with real care. She didn't answer from fear or from habit. She thought about 33 years of mornings making coffee while the fields went from dark to gray to pale gold in the early light. She thought about the south field, the 160 acres Dale had pledged in secret, the field she used to watch Cassie drive the combine through in the evenings and feel something settle in her chest that she had never found a precise word for. "I want to keep enough of it that it still feels like ours," she said. "I don't need all 480, but I will not give up the south field. That's the field Dale tried to protect, even if he did it the wrong way. I'm not letting the bank have it." Travis nodded slowly. It was not agreement, exactly. It was the sound of someone deciding not to argue anymore. Loretta met with Patricia Drummond twice more that December. Patricia was direct. The strongest path was negotiation, not litigation. The signature question gave them leverage the bank could not dismiss. But leverage was not a guarantee, and the operating note was fully legitimate and due regardless. Patricia's recommendation: offer to sell the north 80 acres, the least productive section, the one with the drainage problem along the east fence line, at fair market value. Apply the proceeds directly against the operating note. Present a restructured repayment plan on the remaining balance. Keep the south field fully out of the conversation. Make it clear in writing that the second lien was legally contested. Let the bank's legal department calculate whether their litigation risk on the signature question outweighed the value of a negotiated outcome. Loretta agreed. She hired a local land broker she had known for 12 years. The North 80 sold in January to a family farming the adjacent section. $64,000, $800 per acre, which was honest money for that drainage ground. She paid $64,000 directly against the operating note. The balance dropped to $78,000. Then she and Patricia drove to Pawnee first and sat across from Gary Prentice and the bank's regional credit manager, a woman who had driven down from Tulsa and who, unlike Gary Prentice, had clearly read Patricia Drummond's letter very carefully before walking into the room. Loretta did not pray in that meeting. She sat straight in her chair and watched the regional credit manager's face and answered every question with the plainest version of the truth she knew. At one point, the regional credit manager looked at Loretta and said, "Mrs. Hale, this bank has done business with your family for 40 years. Loretta said, "I know. That's partly why I'm still in this room." The settlement took 11 days to finalize after that meeting. Patricia Drummond called on a Tuesday afternoon in February. Loretta was in the kitchen. She had vegetable soup going on the stove and the radio on low. The bank would not be pursuing the second lien. The official language was that Pawnee First National had agreed to void the 2001 instrument as improperly executed under joint ownership statutes, in exchange for a full release of Loretta's potential claims regarding origination disclosure. Both sides released both sides. Clean. The operating note, now $78,000 after the North 80 sale, would be restructured over 7 years at 5.9%. Monthly payments Loretta could manage if the wheat held and the herd stayed healthy and Cassie kept running the cattle operation the way she had been. The South Field, Block 4, Section 18, 160 acres of the best ground on the Hale farm, the ground Dale had pledged a loan in the quiet spring of 2001, would carry no lien. It was free. It was theirs. Loretta said, "Thank you, Patricia." She hung up the phone. She turned off the radio. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment without moving. The soup was still going on the stove. Outside the window, the February fields were frost brown and still, the way Oklahoma fields look in the last weeks before the ground softens. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat with her legal pad and her 3 columns, and she cried for the first time since the night after Dale's funeral. Not because she had won, not because everything would be easy from here, but because the South Field was going to stay in her family's hands, and Dale would never know it. And that fact was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time in a way she could not separate into 2 different feelings. She called Cassie at the barn. Cassie said, "You're sure?" Patricia was sure. A pause on a line. Then Cassie said, "He would have been relieved." "Yes," Loretta said. "I think he would have." She called Travis that evening. He was quiet for a long time after she told him. Then he said, "That's good, Mom. That's really good." His voice carried something she hadn't heard in a while. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man who had been pushing in one direction and had just found out the ground shifted while he wasn't looking. The cost had been real. The North 80 acres, the section Dale's father had broken, was gone. In the arithmetic of the settlement, it made sense. In the older arithmetic of land and memory, it was a loss, and Loretta didn't pretend otherwise. She drove past that section on her way to town the following week and looked at it from the truck window, already appearing in the county assessor's records under a different family's name, and felt the particular ache of something that cannot be taken back. But the South Field was there, and the family was still, in its complicated and imperfect way, still a family. There had been one more thing in the manila envelope that Loretta hadn't told anyone about. Not Cassie, not Travis, not Patricia Drummond. At the very back of the envelope, folded in half, was a slip of yellow legal paper. 2 sentences in Dale's handwriting, undated. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about this. I thought I could fix it before anyone had to worry." She didn't know when he'd written it. It could have been the day he signed the note in the spring of 2001. It could have been in the last weeks before his heart gave out. She would never know. She had read it so many times the paper had softened along the fold line. She kept it in the envelope. She kept the envelope in the roll-top desk, in the false bottom drawer where she had found it. She left the drawer slightly unclosed, so she would never have to struggle to get it open again. The spring of 2004 was a good planting season in Pawnee County. Not a miracle season, just a normal good one. Adequate moisture through March, mild temperatures in April, wheat going clean. Cassie ran the planting operation with a neighbor's equipment and 2 part-time hands from around the county. Loretta handled the books and made lunch for the workers and drove the grain truck when an extra driver was needed. They planted the south field last in the 3rd week of April, just before the rain came. Loretta drove out to the south section that evening and sat on the tailgate watching the field in the late light. The red dirt had gone dark from the moisture. The sky behind the low Osage Hills was the kind of orange that only happens in Oklahoma in the spring, that deep burning color that looks like it won't last and doesn't, but is something while it's there. She thought about Dale once. She let herself wonder, briefly and without bitterness, if he had ever sat on this tailgate in a spring evening knowing the field had a lien on it. She figured he probably had. She figured it had weighed on him the way things weigh on men who think that protecting people means not naming the weight to them. She didn't entirely understand it. She wasn't certain she agreed with it. But she had been married to a man for 33 years, and she knew the difference between a secret kept out of selfishness and a secret kept out of a particular kind of love, the kind that does the wrong thing for a reason you can recognize even if you cannot excuse. She forgave him sitting on that tailgate. Not in any formal way, not with words. She just let the anger, which had been smaller than she'd expected, smaller than it probably had a right to be, finish running out. She sat in the field where it had happened and let the spring evening go quiet around her. The farm ran narrow for the first 2 years under the restructured note. Narrow but manageable. The wheat held in 2004. Cattle prices were steady through 2005. Cassie added 12 head to the herd that spring using a government program loan she had researched on her own. By 2006, the monthly note payment had become something they planned for and absorbed rather than something they dreaded in the dark. Travis came back for Christmas of 2004, and he was different. Something had shifted in him since the settlement, though he never named it directly. He helped Cassie with a fence repair on the east pasture, and they worked most of Saturday afternoon without arguing, which was new. He and Loretta sat on the porch the night before he drove back to Tulsa, and he said, "I should have trusted you more on this." Loretta said, "You didn't know what I could do. I wasn't sure I did either." He came back for harvest the following fall, then the fall after that. He never moved back. The HVAC business was his life, and it was a good life, and nobody was asking him to trade it. But there is a difference between a son who visits at Christmas and a son who shows up for harvest. A difference Loretta felt in the same part of her chest where she'd always carried the south field. The bank changed loan officers twice more over the following years. Gary Prentice transferred back to Tulsa in 2005. Loretta had no particular feeling about that. She made her payments on time and built a working relationship with each new officer slowly and carefully, the way she had learned to build everything on a farm, with patience and documentation and the quiet knowledge that nothing signed is ever fully private and nothing private ever fully disappears. Leonard Pryor, the deacon who had given her Patricia Drummond's name in the churchyard that first November, died in the winter of 2007. Loretta brought a pie to his family and sat with his wife for an afternoon and told her what that conversation in the side yard had meant. She said, "He gave me the right name at the right time. Sometimes that's the whole difference." That was the truest way she could say it. Loretta Hale is still on that land. The South Field still goes into wheat every April. The cattle herd is 60 head now, run mostly by Cassie, who expanded the pasture in 2018 with a section she leases from a neighbor to the north. There's a new grain bin where the old one stood. The rolltop desk is still in the farm office. The North 80 is farmed by a different family now. Loretta drove past it for years with the same ache. Then one spring she realized she was only noticing it, not aching anymore, the way you notice a scar that finished healing. That took about as long as she thought it would. Travis brings his youngest daughter out every October for harvest. The girl is 11 now and has no fear of the combine, which Loretta takes as a good sign. The yellow slip of paper is still in the envelope, still in the desk. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about this. I thought I could fix it before anyone had to worry." She never showed it to the children. She may never. Some things inside a marriage stay inside the marriage, even after one half of it is gone. That's not dishonesty. That's just the private dignity of two people who built something together and knew each other well enough to know what the other one meant, even when what they meant was wrong, and even when the cost of that wrong thing was real and permanent and measured in acres. Across this country right now, there are farm families sitting at kitchen tables with stacks of papers they don't fully understand, trying to figure out what a piece of land actually costs and what the bank actually holds, and whether the number in the third column is something that can be survived. If your family has ever faced something like that, a note you didn't know about, a lien on ground you thought was free, a moment when the bank knew more than you did, leave a comment below. I'd like to hear how you handled it. And if someone in your family carried something alone, too long, trying to fix it before anyone had to worry, you're not the only one.